Recording. Welcome, everybody. We're about to get started here. And feel free to keep your video on. It's so nice to see people's faces as we're connecting on this important topic. And it makes this a little bit more humanizing for everyone. So please do keep your videos on if you're willing. And let's get started. So if you're here for the free webinar on feedback practices for your collaborative team, you're in the right place. And I'm Rebecca. I'm the communications wizard here at Round Sky Solutions. And I first wanted to tell you all a little bit about our work so you know where we're coming from and who we are, and get some introductions, and then we'll keep going. So Round Sky is a worker-owned cooperative that works with leaders, aspiring leaders, and organizations that value and want to improve their democratic and participatory processes and their teams and hone in on their leadership potential. That's kind of a lot. So we help teams work better together. And we do that through our courses, coaching, and team or company-based training. And it's grounded in our collaborative operating system and processes, which we call CoLab. And you'll hear more about that because we'll touch on those during this call. And we worked with a lot of people who are navigating to effectively give feedback in their teams, and keep going after that can sometimes be very halting. So that is something that a lot of our teams are talking about, and it seems like a lot of you are interested in that as well. Not surprising. And so moving on a bit for some logistics so everyone knows how to work this if you've never been in Zoom. So if you have any questions or to answer any of our questions, you see a bubble, a chat bubble at the top of your screen. And I will add in a chat here in a moment, but you can ask me a question if you have any questions. You can do it to all attendees, so there's options, or you can ask me anything personally or talk to me. My name on there is Round Sky, or Cecile, although I will be the one that will be fielding questions. So you'll get a quicker response from me. And then in general, we're asking everyone to keep your mics on mute, and just so that our speakers tend to take up the loudest noises. So we want to be sure that we can all hear well. And at the end, we'll have time to ask questions where people can unmute if they'd like to get a little bit deeper. So, and this will be recorded for those who want to review it afterward, as well as those who can't make it today, then they can review the recording. So you will be recorded, and I am, and you are right now. So let's start with some introductions. So I'd love to hear from folks of your name, your location, what brought you to this webinar today, and specifically any questions or scenarios that are on your mind. So we already have some people answering, and I'll read them out so that people who are on audio only can see that. So we have one person from Pennsylvania who privately messaged me, so I won't say your name, and they're curious about your ideas and our offerings. Great, welcome. If you have any questions around what exactly, that would be great. And Mariko is here from Shelburne, Vermont, curious about communication and self-managed teams and how to navigate friend and colleague boundaries. Absolutely. As we're in these collaborative teams, we're very much peers, so it takes away the boss relationship often, or maybe it's more fuzzy. That's a really great question. And if others want to introduce yourself, Tina is here from Aptos in California. Wants more insight into communication. Nice to see you, and glad you could make it. So keep introducing yourselves and say hello to each other. I will now introduce myself and then pass it to Cecile. So I'm Rebecca, as I said earlier, and I joined Round Sky about 2 years ago, or a little over 2 years ago now. And what brought me to this work is the importance of processes and structures to get us where we want to be. And I also wanted to enter the worker co-op movement more fully to gain a better understanding of what economic justice looks like for me, as I come from a fragmented class background. So I currently live in New Orleans, and I've been here for about 5 years, originally from California. And outside of Brown Sky, I do anti-racist organizing with a collective here in New Orleans. I play volleyball and try to make it back to California as much as I can. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today because I've personally experienced some of the difficulties around giving feedback. It can be quite vulnerable for both people involved, whether it's in a work situation, organizing. Knowing how to give feedback in the right place is tricky. So I'm really excited to dive into this a little bit more, and I'll pass it off to Cecile to let her introduce herself to you.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm Cecile. I'm one of the co-founders of Round Sky Solutions, and I live near Montpelier, Vermont. I've been a social entrepreneur for about 30 years and have experienced for myself a lot of challenging organizational environments, including frustrating experiences with feedback. And so motivated by the waste of time, energy, and creativity that ineffective collaboration communication practices, including feedback practices, represents, I took up a deep dive into organizational and individual development in search of an answer. In particular, I was really curious what power is and developed some theories about power to map or explain the dynamics I commonly saw at work in organizations. I synthesized this research I'd been doing with my career experiences, and from that research, I created a map of what organizations are already communicating about and need to communicate about, and a set of processes called CoLab that reliably deliver healthy forms of power in action, including much more fun, engaging, and effective feedback practices. So I published Collaboration That Works, a ruthlessly practical handbook for a generative world, as a training manual that summarizes the research and introduces CoLab for organizations. So when we're ready, we can talk a little bit about what we're going to explore in this webinar here today. And so yeah, I'm delighted to be here, as Rebecca said, to explore this topic. It's really very active for many of us, how to offer feedback. And just to clarify that for this particular webinar, the term feedback can mean many different things. But for today, we'll be using it in the following way: as feedback that occurs when outputs of a system are routed back as inputs, as part of a chain of cause and effect that forms a circuit or a loop. So the term feedback can refer to both positive and negative feedback. And today we're going to start by looking at why effective feedback practices are so important, followed up by an introduction to 5 practices for facilitating generative feedback. And after today's webinar, we'll be sending you the next actions, the tools that we mentioned, and some opportunities for further learning. We'll wrap up with some next steps you can consider and a Q&A. And so now I'll pass it back to Rebecca, who's going to go into a little bit more interaction with you all.
Great, thanks. So thanks for the continued introduction. Feel free to chat with each other. And as you're going back in there, we'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you here. What kind of experiences do you have giving or receiving feedback? Like what happens? And someone already mentioned wanting to work through defensiveness and feedback, and I hear you. I've definitely been there. So please share what your experiences are. What kind of things pop up, positive or negative or neutral. And while you do that, I'll share one myself. This was one of the first weeks that I was working at Round Sky, and we have this thing called an personal development topic. And you create a topic where something you want to work on, which I had never done in a workspace before, and then I got to hear everyone's feedback on what they thought that meant, like for working with me, and how that, like how they were interacting with that. And it felt very scary at first, but then it also felt really generative, that I was getting this really honest, not only critical, also appreciative feedback. So that is a really positive experience that I've had, that I hadn't had before. So feel free to add yours here. Jean-Marie is coming from Pittsburgh and asked to do some consulting with a Democratic schools staff group to increase their feedback space and skills. They're looking to expand the relational skills they already have to support their organization. Absolutely. Those relational skills and giving feedback are important, since defensiveness is inevitable in our culture. Please do keep sharing. I see that people are a little shy. And we'll keep going. It's never too late to share if something pops up as we keep going, or something that resonates with you. Definitely let us know. So I'll pass this back to Cecile.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for your thoughts about feedback. I see some others coming in on the chat box there, but let's take a moment and sort of dig into what some of the common challenges with giving and receiving feedback. Many of us have experienced frustrating, sometimes even terrible experiences with giving and receiving feedback. And so just to name a few top examples from my own experience and research, we have people being accusatory and snide. You know, if it's not subtle, then disagreements can come out more directly, which further undermines our ability to work together. People can get offended and defensive, including arguments about who is right, erupting and derailing everyone's participation. Sometimes we have issues with just like no feedback being offered because it's simply easier and less chaotic to not bring difficult things up. Or we have feedback that's delivered in a confrontational manner, and feedback that's offered in an accusatory and blaming manner can directly undermine the ability of the individual to receive it. Conversely, sometimes we get feedback that is offered but in such a dilute manner and without any teeth that really nothing changes. So when feedback is offered, often we get this immediate responsive defensiveness and gaslighting, sometimes turning the problem around by questioning the feedback offerer's experience and perspective and making the problem about the person giving the feedback. Can be a real tricky one. Also, collectives can end up waiting until an incident occurs that costs the organization before directly addressing the causal individual behavior. So those are just some, it's an incomplete list, but it's a place to start. I hope these are familiar for you in one way or another. So let's talk a little bit about why is this a problem? I suppose, it's somewhat intuitively obvious, but since ineffective or destructive feedback processes are so endemic, it's really easy to think that it's normal or unavoidable. And I'm here today to tell you that while it may be normal, like it happens all the time in all kinds of organizations, it's not healthy and it is entirely avoidable. The problem with accepting poor feedback practices is the following also incomplete list of consequences. Our quality of work decreases. Chronic issues that go unchallenged and unchanged degrade the quality of work and the work environment for everyone. We also get disengagement increasing. Poor feedback systems leave people feeling powerless and frustrated with a sense of being stuck. Growth slows. Without effective feedback mechanisms, we can experience barriers to personal and team and organizational growth. Another common consequence is an unfair distribution of feedback. People who are amenable to feedback can get a disproportionate amount of feedback because they are willing to receive, while those who may need the feedback the most and react defensively when offered the feedback are not confronted because their behavior can get aggressive, either directly or passively. And we also get wasted time. Really, the process of giving feedback derails, if it's not working well, it can derail important conversations and take up way too much space and time. And of course, derailed efforts. The emotions resulting from ineffective feedback sessions distract everyone from their work, sapping our organizational energy and focus. There's really nothing like an argument in the middle of a meeting for making everyone feel worse. So today I'm going to show you 5 practices out of dozens that we've researched and synthesized into the collaborative operating system called CoLab that we teach. And today we're going to talk about these top 5 practices we recommend for getting started. And from there, we'll walk you through some of the details, give you some next actions, and you'll have a little exercise that you can try during the week. We'll also send you the recording afterwards so you can listen to anything that caught your attention earlier. And we'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so just be sure to jot anything down as we go along, and we can dive deeper at the end. And also, really important, don't be discouraged if you don't grasp all of this perfectly the first time through. It's part of what we teach in our Level 1 program, which you can find out about more online. But this can take some time to integrate. So on that note, let's dive into our first practice. All right, well, number 1, and perhaps the most overarching practice I'd like to recommend is to normalize conflict. And let's start by talking a little bit about what does conflict mean. So a definition of conflict is a difference in perspective or a point of view that prevents agreement. Essentially because we are all unique beings with unique perspectives, conflict happens. It's just part of the setup of being human and being, on the planet with a number of other people who just have inherently different perspectives. So it's normal from that perspective. And many of you may be in co-ops or have democratic or participatory or even teal teams. And it's really important to acknowledge that just because we're trying to work together in this cooperative way does not mean that there won't be conflict. So the real opportunity we have here is to ask ourselves how we want to use the conflict. The main reframe that I want to offer you here is to see and relate to conflict as fuel for the organization, as fodder for understanding what could be better in the organization or what the organization needs. And part of normalizing conflict involves integrating inclusive feedback practices that are not just from the top down. I'd like to also emphasize that the practices we've researched, built, and teach are for self-managed teal or participatory work environments, and are qualitatively different than top-down feedback practices, where you get, one manager who's sort of in charge of giving you the feedback. So I want to underscore, conflict itself is not the problem. It's what we do with it that matters. The question really isn't what's the problem with conflict, but how we manage or relate to that conflict, how we use it, what we make of it, and how we manage it or don't. One other key perspective that's needed to normalize conflict is an understanding of trauma. Most of us have experienced some form of trauma from group situations. Some of us have been publicly shamed. Some of us have been attacked directly or indirectly for the perspectives we represent. And some of us have lost our jobs, faced dire economic consequence due to conflict. So all of this unprocessed trauma can come to work with us and is part of the topography of conflict in our teams. It's important to recognize this. And that means even if you don't see it on the outside, it's still there. This means that when we are proposing new ways of working with conflict, it's important that we have lots of empathy for ourselves and for others, and that we have a clear, effective, and supportive practices that reliably can turn conflict into positive outcomes. That way we can build our experience of conflict being something positive over time. In addition, and especially when dealing with trauma, using somatic approaches to leadership to understand what's going on and to gently enable oneself and one's team to make good use of conflict can be essential and transformative. And we spend more time working on somatic approaches in our trainings. So, let's talk a little bit about what your next action could be from here. We'd like to suggest that you start and notice and write down how your organization currently handles conflict, including the small things like the amount of gossip and water cooler bickering. From there, you can create a plan for normalizing conflict more effectively. Over the next couple of weeks, You'll notice the patterns, which give you insight onto how conflict could be a great place for feedback, and for simply how your team is working together. And you can bring those thoughts and insights that you've come to our informational call on September 6th in 2 weeks to tell us what you've learned and ask any further questions as well. So once you've taken some time to analyze, we have some very effective suggestions for how to create an environment where conflict is normalized. For example, one tool that our clients have found to be a game changer in normalizing conflict is to institute what we call a standard meeting practice that builds the agenda from the tensions of all the team members. Now in CoLab, we use the term tension not as a negative word, but to refer in general to the difference between where we are and where we want to be. So there's simply, essentially, what's on each of our minds that relates to my team and constitutes agenda items. Tension surfacing acts as a powerful feedback mechanism for teams and organizations. It really provides relevant and timely input into the system of an organization or a team. Tension surfacing is also a great way to begin to build somatic awareness and capacity, because the sensing of our tensions is fundamentally a somatic process conducted on behalf of the team by the individual. It's also important to include in your meeting practice a means of rapidly processing those tensions into incremental movement forward, which we'll talk more about shortly. So after the webinar, we'll send you a chart that explains the standard meeting practice so that you can envision this for your team. It's a lot to take in, so make sure it works for you, and please come to the next call with your questions.
And it looks like we did have some question that's a little bit related to this. Is I'll just read it out for you. It's a little ways up on the chat box. Is this person is struggling with giving feedback when it's not received well, and often finds themselves refraining from giving feedback out of not wanting to have an uncomfortable situation. And they'd love to know how to create that safe container for expressing honest feedback when it is just a few people holding the space and are the people who are receiving the feedback.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we'll talk a couple of the other practice suggestions we have get into this question of how we create a safe and effective personal development practices, because that's a piece of feedback. But the key thing that I want to sort of emphasize is that feedback can take many shapes, and often something that we think is about a person or an individual, it may actually have organizational roots. There may be lack of clarity organizationally that is creating the conflict, right? It's creating the problem, driving the need for feedback. And so, for example, just a quick example, if your team doesn't already have a transparent place to track projects and a place where you're reporting on your projects regularly, then accountability as a system is not present in your team. And the frustration that we might feel for a colleague who's not doing what they said they would do is partly perhaps on their part, but it's also partly because we lack a team system for collaboratively being accountable to each other. And so to the extent that we're able to separate out what is truly personal or interpersonal feedback for someone from organizational issues is really critical. And I'm about to talk a little bit more about that. But so creating that safe container, it begins, in my estimation, with the standard meeting practice as a regular part of what your organization does, even if you're 2 or 3 people on a team. It's really a fantastic place to sort of ground and normalize the fact that conflict happens, that we all have feedback and ideas for each other, and here's a place to offer them. Any other questions at this time, Rebecca?
I have not yet, but please feel free to add them as we go, and we'll have time at the end as well to address anything that doesn't fit into the next actions necessarily. It's a vast realm of ways to give feedback.
All right. Let's take a little moment to talk about the next practice we want to recommend. And that's actually to leverage appreciation. And this practice is really about building up our ability to appreciate each other readily during the course of our work together. And being able to do that helps create the space for challenging feedback that also needs to happen. So speaking of creating a safe container, having an environment of appreciative relationship to each other is part of that safe container. It's not the only part, but it's important. So appreciation, really, no matter the context, especially if it's authentic, is nourishing to our souls and supports our well-being personally and collectively. It's really helpful to have some specific times when you as a team can offer appreciation to each other. For example, you could include an appreciation round toward the end of every meeting or at the beginning of every meeting, or a chance to appreciate people for the good work they've done when they're reporting on their projects. Practices like these are really helpful for normalizing appreciation and building up the internal team capacity to leverage moments of authentic appreciation on behalf of a better working environment and a more effective team. So while this one sounds fairly straightforward and simple, what I've learned from working with many, many teams is that it can actually feel kind of awkward to begin with. So we wanted to offer you a next action to just sort of tip your toe into this idea. But one idea is to use your regular meeting practices to embed periods of appreciation for each other. It's important, if you do that, to help people find the real and authentic appreciations. And one way to do that and make it easier for people is to ask them to reflect on something that's relatively recent or even current, like it's happened during that meeting. For example, you can try ending your next 3 meetings with quick appreciations for each other and or the work that you've accomplished during your meeting together. Be sure to check back in with the team on how it's going once you've tried it for a bit and make adjustments as you need to. Our clients have often noticed that even though it feels unnatural or uncomfortable at first, that appreciation practices actually build more capacity for more critical and hard feedback. So it's kind of a muscle building practice, which really helps the whole team. And we have a whole process that we've developed to integrate this into your work in a meaningful way. And we'll be sharing that in our email afterwards. However, start out with this next very small action to offer appreciations for each other. So we'll be sending you some information on this, as I said, and we'd love to hear how it goes and share back on our next call. But the basic idea is to just spend a few minutes thinking about who on your team you might appreciate right now. And what would you appreciate them for? And see if you can come up with 3 to 5 different appreciations just on your own. And you could choose to share that with them or not. But it gets you sort of into the mindset of appreciating people, either themselves for their personal qualities or the work that they've done. All right, well, let's dip into practice number 3 then. So on this one, it relates really to the first practice we offered you as a recommendation. And again, that's to establish a participatory meeting practice where the agenda is built from all the tensions of all the team members, with tensions being anything between where we are and where we want to be. So they could be positive as well. Once tensions are surfaced, it's important to have a simple, rapid, and effective means of incrementally moving these tensions forward. And a powerful way of achieving this is to use the idea of a tension holder. Now, the tension holder is the person who raised the tension. And their job then, when you're processing the tension, is to help identify what will incrementally move the item forward for them on behalf of the team. And once that output is identified, you can then record it and move on to the next tension. This helps to keep tension processing light and agile. In addition, one of the concepts that our research has turned up is that there are different types of tensions that benefit from different kinds of processes in order to reliably and efficiently move tensions forward. An example of this would be that if someone raises a tension about a team policy or a team agreement that's not working, having an efficient and effective collective decision-making process to use to update that team agreement is really essential. And likewise, if someone raises an emotionally charged issue with another individual, the whole team benefits from having an effective interpersonal tension clearing process. Another hidden benefit of sorting your tensions and using effective processes for that particular type of tension is that you can now use your regular meeting process to surface issues people have in a way that depersonalizes the conflict, as I was saying a little earlier. You know, if we have a tension, for example, that starts out looking like an issue with Joe's work style, it may actually have to do more with lack of role clarity or misaligned strategic priorities. And so instead of targeting Joe as the problem, sorting your tensions allows the team to identify the collective roots of a problem and to work together rather than polarizing to take the conflict and make a better, stronger team together. So your next action on this particular practice would be to try surfacing your own personal work tensions over the next week. Take a moment and write them down and think about how you might ask the group to help process them into an outcome that would move it forward. And when I say move it forward, I do mean it doesn't have to solve it forever. It's like what will begin to unravel this issue? What are some of the next things you can do that will move it forward? This will give you a little practice with holding and processing tensions before you bring this to your team. And your team processes with tensions, in terms of asking the tension holder to shepherd that tension on behalf of the whole team to find a clear outcome for that tension that will incrementally move it forward. So it's important to practice on your own, and then you'll be a little bit more fluid with that motion when you begin to try it with your team. So our clients have found that this simple change has made their collaborative meetings far more effective and efficient and built team cohesion and created meaningful outcomes right then and there, rather than waiting for change to happen someday or perhaps not at all.
Yeah, thanks, Cecile. I just want to kind of call out that, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Jean-Marie mentioned that they really connected with the word tension in relationship to the somatic experience, constriction, tension, shutdown, how that happens. So just wanted to say that that is absolutely connected to how we're sensing how we have this wisdom in our somatic experience, our body experience. You want to talk more about that?
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you, Jean-Marie. And I would add that when you've learned this practice of moving your tensions incrementally forward, you can sense that something's also been moved forward because there's a relaxing in the body that one can feel, and one can also sense that in the rest of the team. It's quite lovely. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. All right. Well, let's dig into practice number 4. This is also a really important one, sometimes really hard to do. So this practice is to use empathy first. If you've sorted your tensions, you'll be able to know when you have a tension that is primarily about an interpersonal, which is an emotional conflict with someone, or a personal development issue. Something in either myself or someone else that's really about the ways in which we need to grow and get better at doing simple things, maybe like tracking our tasks. And like all kinds of tensions, these really benefit from a clear and effective process that the team or organization has been trained in and everyone knows how to use. The key component of an effective emotional process or an interpersonal process is to focus on the emotions first with the intention of restoring relationship. Typically, when dealing with a charged emotional issue, trust between people has been eroded, and trying to make decisions about what to do differently can falter or fail entirely if we've not addressed the emotional fracture first. So we recommend using a non-defensive emotional validation that focuses on restoring relationship first and processing details and facts of a situation as a separate tension, possibly at an entirely different time, actually. And also personal reflection for each individual involved on what they are learning about their needs and themselves as part of that experience. So let's take away a quick look in terms of your next action about how can you concretely give this a next try. So for your next action with this practice, we recommend doing a little thought experiment with a recent emotionally charged encounter that you've had. So imagine the encounter again and how it actually went. Then you can imagine the encounter with you taking a moment to set aside your own perspective, just for a moment, not permanently, and putting yourself in the other person's shoes as fully as you can, including their emotions, including what they think happened, and then expressing empathy for them with their experience. Several keys here. One is that the empathy you are able to extend does not mean that you are wrong and they are right. It simply means that under the circumstances as they see them, you can get how they would feel the way that they do. So we recommend trying writing this down without engaging the other person at first. So just practice it internally. Emotionally charged conflict, really, it is inevitable, and our teams really need to be able to process these types of tensions. It takes some self-awareness and training and practice before trying this out on a tense interpersonal conflict within your team. We've developed a facilitated practice that helps people to restore this relationship first, and after that, tackle what might need to change going forward. This process takes practice and time and training to handle in those trickier situations. But we'll be sending out the summary of this practice to you in your follow-up email so you can take a look at it and see if it fits your particular experience and situation. All right, well, let's dig into practice number 5 then, which is to give challenging feedback a supportive place to go. So back to that question earlier, what's a safe container? How do we do this? Because it does require a safe container in order for it to reliably go well. So when it comes to feedback in general, it's easier even to give positive or appreciative feedback. And if normalizing appreciative feedback is supported by having a structure within which to practice, creating a safe way in which to offer challenging feedback is even more important. So in addition to all the other practices we've mentioned, like depersonalizing conflict that is fundamentally more about team needs than about an individual, even though on the surface it may appear to be about one person, we also recommend establishing a set of regular practices that support the giving of negative feedback to an individual within the expectation of ongoing personal development for all. So here are a few concrete ideas that our clients have found useful and our students dive into during our level 2 course. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, so these are just a couple different ways to think about it. First, consider using an anonymous form for colleagues to offer their experience of the individual, both the positive and the negative, followed by an opportunity to meet for that individual, each individual, to meet with a coach that can help them digest that feedback and create a personal development plan for themselves that addresses the feedback, including follow-up sessions to encourage accountability and to help them, change their plan and adjust it as they need to based on what they're learning about themselves. So the key thing about this type of approach is just that in order to make change in ourselves personally, it really requires that we have some clear idea about what it is that we want to change, and then we do some looking at really underneath why are we not making that change perhaps, and then some really concrete practices as to what am I going to try differently. And last but not least, by any means, is that circuit back to accountability, a chance to meet with the coach again to say, here, how's it going? This is what I want to try differently, to get feedback from the coach. So that full cycle is really needed in order for feedback that we might have to actually mean something and to go somewhere. Just offering an individual personal development feedback, for example, doesn't necessarily mean anything is going to change for them. And they may end up just feeling like stuffed and stymied and frustrated and really have nowhere to go with it. The key is to give them a practice that spells out how to manage that feedback and to actually make concrete personal change. So the second method that we recommend is to use a group coaching model where all team members can participate. And this includes a structure for feedback offering that focuses on the experience of the individual who's speaking, so use of I statements versus you statements. And that structure is also non-defensive, so that it's facilitated, and should defensiveness arise in the person receiving the feedback, the facilitator's job is to say, hey, thanks so much. This isn't the place for that. Right now, I just want you to summarize what you've heard from that other person. We can talk about your defensiveness later. In addition, the group coaching process should really include the identification, as I was just saying, of a clear personal development topic, a rigorous understanding of one's current way of being, and the competing commitments that are in the way of making personal change, as well as new practices intended to build capacity around our topic, and a time for reporting back on progress or lack thereof for each person. So on this particular next practice, we want to recommend that with all of that as potential, you start with yourself and see how it goes. So in this case, take a moment and analyze your own challenges. What is your personal development topic? What is it that you've heard from other people in your life? You can even go out and ask them right now and say, hey, what would you tell me? And from there, create practices to learn a new way of doing things and see where your experiments take you, and then evolve your practices so that you can continually grow. We have a leadership assessment that we'll send out to you after this call to help you with this process. And we highly encourage you to also analyze your organizational personal development practices. If there aren't any, that's a really rich place to consider, like what practices should we have in place? If you do have practices, how are they working? What might they be missing? From there, you can determine what kinds of personal development practices might work in your particular organization. And you are welcome to learn and use the practices we've developed for the personal development that our students find effective and fun for their teams, and a great way for cooperatives and other types of teams to tune into the co-op principle of education and training. So on that note, I can take a moment and begin to talk a little bit about what some of the benefits are of doing this, because while it can be a lot of work to integrate new ways of offering feedback, new and effective ways of offering feedback, there's some pretty amazing benefits to this as well. So it's well worth the effort. Imagine what it might be like for you to have an organization full of inspiring leaders with the tools that enable you to leverage the conflict that naturally arises in organizations into positive solutions that save you time and energy, and open up the space for everyone on the team to be more of their full selves, which simply feels better, and frankly, it gets better results. So you can look forward to the following: being able to work together productively with flow and satisfaction. Working in collaboration with others can be profoundly frustrating, and that frustration is simply a drain on both organization and individual. So getting to a flow and satisfaction produces a host of benefits, including longevity. In other words, people stick around longer and contribute more and offer more of themselves while they're there. Another benefit is not getting stuck on the issues. The feeling of being stuck in one's work with others is corrosive, especially if it's a consistent feature of your meetings and your work together. Being able to move forward even on difficult issues is like opening the windows in a stale room and letting the light and air in. Another benefit is better innovation and problem solving. Working together is all about facing challenges and surmounting obstacles. Being equipped to do so not only efficiently, but also with creativity and innovation is critical to organizational success in this complex and constantly changing business environment that we all find ourselves in. Another benefit, mutual support and accountability. One of the biggest challenges of self-managed work environments where we are explicitly sharing power is accountability, both how we support each other in getting our work done and how we hold each other accountable in the process. Another benefit is meaningful, satisfying participation, including mutual empathy and the support for the challenging process of developing ourselves based on the feedback from others who work with us every day. And frankly, for me, the best part, and the best part I've seen in my students as well, is that learning all of these processes, you're going to be able to use these skills over and over again in all kinds of different contexts. Everything from your home to your place of work, to your schools, to your volunteer organizations. These processes are effective and can apply across a multiplicity of different kinds of environments. So to summarize these practices, briefly, number one, normalize conflict. It happens, and the opportunity here is to actually use it as food. Number two, leverage appreciation. Build up that container that is full of appreciation for each other, real and genuine, for the work we do and who we are. Surface and process tensions regularly. If this is part of your organizational culture, then giving and offering and receiving feedback will be a much more normal part of things. And when something really challenging comes up, you will have the support structure to be able to manage it. And number four, use empathy first. It's so hard, especially when there's something that someone's telling you that you really don't want to hear and it's emotionally charged. And it is so powerful in terms of turning around the conversation and creating a generative outcome. And practice number five, give challenging feedback a supportive place to go. So again, back to that idea that we all need to be doing personal development, and making that explicit as part of your organization is transformative. And one more thought about the relevance of feedback from research into adult development that has occurred over the last few decades, including from folks like William Torbert, Robert Keegan, and Joyner and Josephs, and many others. So in a nutshell, what they've discovered is that our relationship to other people and their perspectives, including their feedback, changes as we grow to be more and more inclusive, and from feedback rejecting to feedback tolerating to feedback seeking and integrating. And so when it comes to feedback practices for self-managed teams, the single perhaps most important powerful practice you can engage in yourself is to go and seek and integrate feedback from others who know you, including the people you might least want to hear it from. It's a powerful developmental action, and it's something you can do all on your own. Once you and your team get good at giving and receiving feedback, you'll be able to take incoming conflict and metabolize it into something good, something that builds relationship and organizational effectiveness. But gaining these process tools and the practice in safe places to know how to use these things reliably on the ground requires research, training, and practice. And so we'd like to tell you a little bit about an opportunity to learn how to metabolize conflict through our Level 1 Collaborative Leadership Certification Program. And I'm going to pass it back to Rebecca, who will share a little bit more about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Cecile. It is really powerful to talk about these practices and how, at the end, we all only have control over ourselves, and just starting there and seeing how that, starting micro and then it gets to macro. That's kind of how I'm viewing this in lots of ways. And then there are those structural changes as well. So I'm really happy to be seeing both of those. And so what I want to offer to everyone on the call is to consider coming to our informational call on the Level 1 program and to experiment with the ways that we can start bringing this into our lives and our teams. It's sometimes we need that outside support and training in order to make real change, not reinventing the wheel, perhaps. So I want to share a little bit about this training with you so you can decide for yourself if this is something you want to seek out, if what we've talked about today has spoken to you. So first off, this is a 10-week remote learning program, so it can anywhere in the world you can be as long as you have a computer. And it's for leaders within organizations or teams, the coaches and consultants and other visionaries who are seeking to put some of these tools for democratic and participatory leadership into action. And at the same time, to build up leadership that's generative rather than dominating, which as we've talked about on this call, we see in our traditional feedback practices. They're often dominating and not human-centered. So I like to think of this training as having two different tracks. So one is being those leadership and management tools, the concrete, hard skills for your team, and the other being maybe what some people might say soft, this personal leadership development and somatic awareness. So over the 10 sessions, we focus on collaborative and remote management practices, as well as in person. So either, and that includes how to facilitate that standard meeting practice that Cecile mentioned in the first practice, and also the necessary skills it takes to nurture that culture where feedback is welcome. So you can facilitate a meeting with all the right steps, but having that capacity to create an environment where feedback is a special skill. So, and practiced as well. And we also dive into accountability. Often when we're thinking about feedback, accountability is one of those buzzwords. Somebody didn't do this, somebody didn't do that. And so we really focus on that in our self-managed teams. So having some practice around individual and collective project tracking, which is also a great space for that regular appreciation and critical feedback can come out there, which we didn't talk about today, but it's something we really dive into in this training. And then we also dive into decision making and mapping out roles, which definitely feed this feedback track about how is your team working together. And so just to kind of sum that up we have 5 main projects, which I've touched on. So that personal development topic that really hones in on how yourself are growing, how you're getting feedback from other people to keep growing, to change what your current way is. A personal task tracking project that I mentioned, really nurturing that accountability for yourself. And our students have said that people talk to them after they've done the training and said, wow, what's happened? Your capacity has grown so much. So you get that actual feedback from the people you're working with as you're implementing that. We have that scopes and roles project, and and introducing this to a team. How do you get your team to even want to do personal development together? That can be hard in itself to get your team to get on board. So this is a really helpful space for troubleshooting that and creating the space that your self-managed cooperative participatory team needs to grow together. And so I'll stop there with just a little bit of logistics before we get into the Q&A. So it's really a great place to learn more. Is on September 6th is our informational call, and it will be on Zoom as well, and it's free just to hear from some students that have done the program. And it's also a great place to come back with those next actions and ask questions about them, see how it relates to the program, see if that's something that you want to do, and then get some support as well. And the applications are due on September 13th, so you have a bit of time to decide if this is a route you'd like to take for yourself, which I can say from experience has been really mind-blowing for my own personal development. So with that, I would like to take any questions from you all about what we've presented to you today. Anything that's still on your mind, like I've had this situation and this is happening. Do you have any insight about that? We'd love to hear that. Any questions about the level 1 program? And feel free to unmute your mic and just jump in here if you'd like. And I'll give us a few moments of space to think about what questions might be brewing for you.
So I'd like to ask a question. What do you mean by somatic? Are you including feelings, or is it just how your body responds, and how are you using that term?
That's a great question. And in our case, we are talking about somatic awareness, but we're also talking about how do we realign. So how do we work with what we sort of are aware of? And it does include feelings, it includes our body, it includes thoughts that may be going through this, but it's an awareness of our entire physical, heart and mind self as we're showing up in any given instance. Our bodies are incredibly attuned, if we listen to them, to very small nuances, and they can be a powerful tool for both how we show up, but then how we also facilitate other people. Did that answer your question, Hina?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
Ask away.
Okay, just making sure you can hear me.
Yeah.
I love how you talk about a lot of the time a team will look at just one person and it's not necessarily about the one person on a team, and it's probably more of an organizational issue. I'm currently facing something that feels like a little bit of a combo of that, where they feel sort of held hostage to not being able to create this container for feedback because there's a pretty big pushback from one or maybe two individuals on the team saying, don't talk to me about emotions at all. I don't know if you have any any thoughts there.
So were you saying that you feel a bit held hostage by others who don't want to go there? Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, in that particular instance, one of the places that you can sort of just get started with is that standard meeting practice, which is a very neutral place to address sort of all team questions. It's not specifically about the emotions at all. And so it allows a neutral space really for every person to show up and get their needs met. And if you are finding folks are resistant to even doing that, what I recommend doing is talking with them enough to understand what are some of the challenges they face working on your team. And then drawing that back to how the standard meeting practice can help them. So, and that as a principle in general may help sort of open some doors with you with that particular individual, is to simply say, well, tell me, what's challenging for you about working here, because we all have different perspectives. So that extension of wanting to listen, wanting to understand, wanting to empathize with them may provide a safer place to sort of begin to make these changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've approached doing that some, where we raise tensions, sort of like you were talking about, raise and air regularly, and there's been a couple, I guess I could call them just sort of outbursts of that defensiveness factor that happen later after the meeting, and so it's created sort of this just hesitancy to do it again from all parties. And so there's a disrepair at the moment because of that. And
yeah,
it was very individual focused, but I also see the lack of container.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Without knowing the sort of the details of what was happening in the meetings and what the outbursts are about, which I'd be happy to pick up with you offline at some point, it's a little hard to say what to exactly try differently. But one of the sort of third person perspectives I can offer is that a team has to communicate in order to get its work done, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have an effective standard meeting practice, then the communication work that you need to do is doubled, tripled, quadrupled, because now everyone has to sort of go around and get the information they need, sometimes 2-3 times, in order to actually move forward. So it's highly inefficient, is my point, to not have a central place where the team can gather and do that communication efficiently. And so it's ostensibly simply a way for you all to make yourselves more effective and more efficient. And the other piece I would sort of add to that is that it's okay if people have upsets. It's okay. So what? Does it really have to be a showstopper? Do we really need to like let that outburst stop the rest of the team? And so sort of taking a little bit more of a stance that it's fine with me if you have an outburst, but that doesn't, I'm not going to let that get in the way of what the team needs here.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. That's not easy though. Yeah.
I think it is inevitable. There is this interesting tension between people who believe that feelings should not be allowed in the workplace ever, like no emotions allowed. And as we get into less hierarchical businesses or ways of being, it just is a part of who we are, right? We're bringing our full selves to our work. We're spending lots of hours. We're there often more than we're at home. So it's just inevitable that feelings happen. Maybe we don't center them all the time, but it's a part of being a human. Yeah. So I don't know if that maybe validates what you're experiencing in your needs in your workplace. It may not speak to other people, but I think that just knowing that for myself is helpful enough. Like, okay, this is, if someone doesn't really understand it quite yet, this is part of the work, part of collaboration.
The irony of not wanting to have emotions talked about, yet having the emotions be the hijacker of all things. So yeah, right. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I'm really glad you noticed that, Robin, because that is a really well, it's frankly quite passive aggressive, and what an irony, right? And so if there's a way for you to have that conversation and be like, emotions aren't okay for you to discuss, but it's okay if you then have outbursts, that's sort of really uneven and unequal and unfair. So can we find a different way to do this?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm certainly your choir.
And then we're a little bit past time, but maybe we'll take one more question. And if anyone has something burning, I have seen some people like leaning forward. So let's want to offer the space for one more question. All right.
Well, I want to just extend my appreciation. I thought this was a wonderful seminar, a lot of useful stuff, and deep. So it needs to be digested more and more. So thank you. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Hina.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
And then I want to leave you all with a question. You have many to kind of think about, but really take this back to your wherever you are and think about how is feedback addressed in your team. There's likely not a process. So what's implicitly happening if it's not explicit? And how do you typically give feedback? What do you do? And what do you wish it was like? Just leave that with you. So thank you everyone for being on the call. Hope to see you on September 6th for our free info call to talk about what's come out of this for you and what could be next. So have a great day. Feel free to open your
Thanks,
mic.
everyone. Take care.
Good night.
Bye.
Zoom out. Okay, meeting. Okay, very good.